There is a secret buried inside Stoicism that almost nobody talks about. Not in the books, not in the quotes you see plastered across Instagram, not even in the lectures given by professors who have spent their entire lives studying Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. And once you hear it, you will never look at staying calm the same way again, because the truth is this: the Stoics were not trying to make you happy. They were not trying to help you relax. And they were absolutely not interested in giving you inner peace as some kind of pleasant bonus prize for good behavior. What they were actually doing, quietly, dangerously, was training people to detach from the very things society tells you to chase. And if you actually understood what that detachment demanded, you might not be so eager to call yourself a Stoic anymore, because the first thing they never fully explain is that indifference is not the same as peace. When Epictetus said that some things are not up to us, and some things are not up to us, people today turn that into a cute productivity hack, a way to stop worrying about traffic or bad weather. But that is not what he meant, not even close. He meant that your reputation is not up to you. Your health is not up to you. Whether people love you or abandon you is not up to you. Whether your business succeeds or your body betrays you with illness is not up to you. And the terrifying implication buried underneath that teaching is that you are meant to become almost entirely indifferent to the outcomes of your own life. Not just calm about them, but genuinely unmoved. And most people who read Stoicism today cannot actually do that. And if they're honest with themselves, they don't actually want to, because true indifference to outcomes starts to look less like wisdom and more like emotional exile. And the Stoics knew this, and they let you find that out on your own, because they never tell you up front just how much of yourself you have to give up before the philosophy starts working. And that leads to the second thing almost nobody explains, which is that the Stoics did not believe in forgiveness the way you think they did. You'll hear people say, Marcus Aurelius forgave his enemies, that Stoicism teaches you to let go of grudges and move on with grace. But if you actually read Meditations closely, what you find is something far colder and far more calculated. Marcus did not forgive people because he loved them, or because holding on to anger hurt his soul. He forgave them because he decided other people's flaws were simply not worth his attention, which sounds similar to forgiveness, but is actually its opposite. Forgiveness requires you to still care enough to let go, but Marcus was practicing a kind of philosophical shrug, a total withdrawal of emotional investment, treating the people who wronged him the way you'd treat weather you can't control, not evil to be redeemed, just noise to be filtered out. And once you realize that, a lot of the wisdom you've absorbed from Stoic quote pages starts to look less like emotional healing and more like emotional distancing, a survival technique disguised as virtue, built by men who were, in some cases, dealing with betrayal, exile, chronic illness, or ruling an empire during a plague that killed millions of people. And that context matters, because Stoicism was never born in comfort. It was born in crisis, in Rome during wars and pandemics, in Greece among men who had lost everything. And that origin story is the third thing barely anyone tells you. Stoicism is not a philosophy for people who are doing fine. It is a philosophy built by people staring directly at death, exile, and collapse, and if you try to apply it while your life is stable and easy, you will only get the surface version, the don't sweat the small stuff version. But if your life actually falls apart, if you lose the job, the relationship, the health, the reputation, that is the moment the real philosophy activates. And most people never experience Stoicism in that raw, tested form. They only experience the comfortable simulation of it, quoting Seneca while sipping coffee, never actually finding out whether they could remain unshaken, while everything they love is being taken from them. And this is exactly why the ancient Stoics were suspicious of people who talked about Stoicism too much and practiced it too little. Because Epictetus himself warned his students that if you're constantly explaining the philosophy to others, but your own temper is still short, your own fear of death is still crushing, your own jealousy still eats at you every single day, then you have learned nothing. You have simply memorized vocabulary. And this is where things get uncomfortable for a lot of modern audiences, because so much of what passes for Stoic content online today is exactly that: vocabulary without transformation, aesthetic without substance, cold showers and quotes about control, without the terrifying inner surrender the original philosophy actually demanded. And once you see that gap, the gap between performing Stoicism and living it, you start to realize that the 10 things we're about to walk through in this series are not motivational one-liners. They are, in a very real sense, dangerous ideas. Ideas that ancient teachers hesitated to explain fully because they knew most people were not ready to hear what real acceptance costs. And if you think you already understand what amor fati means, or what it truly means to treat your own death as a daily companion rather than a distant fear, wait until part 2, because what comes next is the part even modern Stoic teachers tend to skip over entirely. The part about how the Stoics viewed love, attachment, and whether you're even allowed to grieve the people you lose. When we left off, I promised you the part almost no modern Stoic teacher wants to touch. The part about love, attachment, and grief, and here it is, laid out without the softening that usually gets added to make it more palatable. The Stoics did not believe you should avoid loving people, but they believed something far stranger and far more disturbing to modern ears, which is that you should love people while simultaneously reminding yourself every single day that they are already gone. Epictetus told his students that when you kiss your child goodnight, you should silently acknowledge that this child is mortal, that this child could die by morning, not as a morbid obsession, but as a discipline meant to strip away the illusion of permanence that makes loss so devastating when it finally arrives. And this is the fourth thing, rarely explained in full. Stoic love is love practiced under the constant shadow of loss on purpose, deliberately, as a kind of emotional inoculation. And if that sounds cold to you, that's because it is cold by design, because the Stoics were not trying to maximize your joy in the moment. They were trying to minimize your devastation later. And those two goals are not the same thing. They are sometimes in direct conflict. And nobody selling you Stoic wisdom on social media wants to admit that the price of that resilience might be a kind of quiet distance from the very people you claim to love the most. And this connects directly to the fifth thing almost nobody explains, which is the Stoic position on grief itself. Because contrary to what most people assume, the Stoics did not say, "Don't grieve." What they actually argued, especially Seneca in his letters of consolation, is that grief is natural, even inevitable, but that prolonged grief, grief that becomes identity, grief that you nurture and perform and refuse to release, because some part of you believes staying sad proves how much you loved someone. That kind of grief is actually, in Seneca's eyes, a form of self-indulgence dressed up as devotion. And this idea makes people furious when they first hear it, because in modern culture we treat the depth of your mourning as proof of the depth of your love. But the Stoics flipped that entirely. They believed a wise person feels the loss fully, allows the tears, allows the pain in the moment it strikes, and then, deliberately, chooses to return to function, to duty, to life, not because they loved less, but because they refuse to let sorrow become a throne they sit on for years. And this is deeply uncomfortable for a culture that has built entire industries around perpetual mourning, memorial culture, grief influencers, anniversary posts that never end, and the Stoics would look at a lot of that behavior and quietly, without cruelty, call it a failure of discipline rather than a triumph of love. And the sixth thing, rarely spoken aloud, is even harder to swallow. The Stoics believed that most people do not actually want wisdom. They want comfort disguised as wisdom. And this is why Epictetus was famously harsh with his students, refusing to coddle them. Because he believed that the moment philosophy starts making you feel good without changing your behavior, it has stopped being philosophy and started being entertainment. And if you look honestly at how Stoicism is consumed today, mostly through short quotes, aesthetic sunrise videos, and phrases like, focus on what you control, slapped onto gym selfies, you start to see Epictetus's fear realized in real time, because none of that requires sacrifice. None of that requires the actual, brutal work of confronting your own mortality daily, your own pettiness daily, your own fear daily. It just requires posting something that sounds wise. And the ancient Stoics, if they could see this, would likely say that most people practicing Stoicism online are doing the exact opposite of what the philosophy demands. They are performing calm rather than earning it. And the seventh thing that almost never gets explained clearly is the Stoic relationship with anger. Because people assume Stoics simply suppress anger, push it down, smile through it. But that is not accurate either. The real teaching, especially from Seneca's essay on anger, is that anger is a kind of temporary madness, a judgment error so severe that a person under its influence is, for that moment, no longer fully rational. And the goal was never suppression. The goal was prevention, catching the false judgment before it ever ignites into anger in the first place, which means that by the time you feel yourself getting angry, according to Seneca, you have already failed the exercise. The real work happens earlier, in how you interpret events before they have the chance to provoke you. And this is a much harder task than simply staying calm in the heat of the moment, because it requires you to examine your assumptions constantly, to ask why you believe someone insulting you is actually harmful to you at all. And most people, even those who call themselves Stoic, never do this deeper work. They simply hold their tongue while boiling internally, which Seneca would say is not Stoicism at all. That's just repression wearing a toga. And once you start to see how much of what we call being Stoic today is actually surface-level suppression, rather than the deep philosophical restructuring the ancients demanded, you start to wonder what else has been diluted, softened, or quietly removed to make this philosophy more marketable. And that is exactly where Part 3 picks up, because next we're going into the most controversial territory yet. What the Stoics actually believed about suicide, about when life is no longer worth living, and why that teaching has been almost entirely erased from every modern Stoic self-help book you've ever read. We're going somewhere heavier now, into territory most self-help versions of Stoicism quietly skip over, because if you actually read the ancient texts instead of the quote card summaries, you find that the Stoics had a genuinely radical, unsettling position on when a human life should end, and they called it the open door, a phrase Epictetus used to describe the idea that death is always available to you, always within reach, and that this availability was not meant to be terrifying. It was meant to be liberating, because if you truly internalize that you can leave at any time, then staying becomes a choice rather than a sentence. And this is the eighth thing rarely explained with any honesty. Stoic philosophy did not treat death as something to fear or avoid discussing, and several major Stoic figures, most famously Cato the Younger, and later, Seneca himself, did not merely write about the open door as an abstract concept. They treated it as a genuine option under specific, extreme circumstances, specifically when a person's ability to live with virtue, dignity, and rational agency had been permanently and completely destroyed by external forces, such as tyranny, torture, or the total loss of one's autonomy. And this is the part that modern audiences find deeply uncomfortable. Because we like our philosophy tidy, we like Stoicism to be about morning journaling and cold showers, not about ancient Romans calmly discussing when life stops being worth continuing. And to be absolutely clear here, because this matters more than anything else in this script, this was never framed by the Stoics as an answer to sadness, to depression, to grief, to a bad week, or to ordinary human suffering. In fact, Seneca explicitly warned against treating death as an escape from emotional pain, arguing that a person who ends their life over something they could have endured with reason and time was not being wise, they were being cowardly. Mistaking impatience for philosophy, and the Stoics were unusually strict about this distinction, believing that fleeing hardship out of fear or despair was one of the worst things a person could do, the opposite of virtue, not an example of it. And this nuance is exactly what gets erased when people casually quote, "The open door is always available," without any of the surrounding context. Because taken alone, out of context, it sounds like permission, when in the actual philosophy, it was almost never meant that way. It was meant as a very narrow, very extreme last resort reserved for situations of total and irreversible loss of freedom, not emotional pain, not disappointment, not even severe illness in most cases, which is why Marcus Aurelius, who suffered from chronic pain and ruled through plague, war, and personal tragedy for nearly 2 decades, never once treated his own suffering as grounds for that door. He kept working, kept ruling, kept writing meditations by candlelight while grieving multiple children and battling disease, because his own philosophy demanded endurance first. Always endurance first. And this is the truth that gets flattened in modern retellings. The Stoics, who are held up as the great teachers of this idea, were, almost without exception, people who chose to stay, who chose to endure catastrophic suffering rather than leave, and the open door was discussed far more often as a philosophical boundary marker, a reminder that you are never truly trapped, than as something they actually recommended people walk through. And if you are someone listening to this who is struggling right now, who feels like your own door is closer than it should be, please hear this clearly. That is not what this philosophy is about. That is not the lesson here. And reaching out to another human being, a crisis line, a therapist, someone who can sit with you in that pain, is not a betrayal of Stoic virtue. It is exactly the kind of rational, self-preserving action the Stoics themselves would have called wise. And once we set that heavy topic down, the ninth thing almost nobody explains becomes almost strange by comparison, because it deals with something far more mundane, and yet somehow more taboo in modern conversation, the Stoic view on wealth, and why nearly every wealthy Stoic in history, including Seneca, one of the richest men in Rome, was accused during his own lifetime of hypocrisy for preaching indifference to money while living in extraordinary luxury. And the explanation for that contradiction, which we'll unpack fully in Part 4, might completely change how you think about what detachment from material things actually means. If you're navigating real emotional pain right now, you don't have to carry it alone. A crisis line or a mental health professional can help in ways a video script can't. And reaching out is a sign of strength, not failure. Let's finish what we started. Because the contradiction sitting inside said, Seneca's life is one of the most quietly scandalous facts in the entire history of philosophy, and almost nobody brings it up when they're quoting his beautiful lines about simplicity and detachment. Because here is the truth. Seneca was not a modest philosopher living in a small room writing letters by candlelight. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in the entire Roman Empire. He owned villas across the empire. He had money out on loan to entire provinces, including, according to some ancient historians, a massive loan to Britain that some scholars believe may have helped trigger a rebellion when he called it in suddenly. And this is the ninth thing rarely explained with any honesty. The man who wrote some of history's most quoted lines about not needing riches to be happy was living a life of extraordinary luxury while writing them. And his critics at the time noticed this immediately. They called him a hypocrite to his face. They said it was easy to preach indifference to wealth while sitting on a fortune. And Seneca's response to this accusation is the part that never makes it into the highlight reels. Because he did not deny being rich. He did not pretend to be poor. Instead, he argued something far more subtle, and honestly, far more useful than simple renunciation. He said that the goal of Stoicism was never to reject money itself. Money is what the Stoics called an indifferent, neither good nor bad on its own. What mattered entirely was your relationship to it. Whether you controlled it or it controlled you. Whether you could lose all of it tomorrow and remain exactly as calm as you were the day before, and Seneca claimed, whether truthfully or not. We will never fully know that he held his wealth the way you might hold a borrowed object, fully willing to return it without complaint the moment life demanded it back. And this reframe is the 10th thing almost nobody explains properly, because modern audiences hear Stoic and imagine someone who owns nothing, sleeps on a hard floor, and rejects comfort entirely, when the actual philosophy was far more practical and, frankly, far more useful for anyone living a normal modern life, because the Stoics were not anti-wealth, they were anti-attachment. They believed you could enjoy a nice home, good food, comfort, even luxury, as long as none of it became the foundation your identity or your peace was built upon. And the real test they proposed was brutally simple. Imagine losing it all overnight, your house, your money, your reputation, your title, and ask yourself honestly whether you would still consider yourself the same person, whether your sense of worth would survive that loss intact. And if the answer is no, if the thought of losing your possessions fills you with genuine existential terror, rather than mild inconvenience, then, according to the Stoics, you do not actually own your wealth. Your wealth owns you, regardless of how much or how little you actually have in the bank. And this is precisely why Seneca kept practicing what he called voluntary poverty, deliberately living like a poor man for short stretches of time, eating the cheapest food, wearing rough clothing, sleeping on hard surfaces, not because he needed to, but specifically so he would never forget how little he actually required to survive, training himself against the quiet, creeping fear of loss that wealth tends to produce in people who have never tested themselves against its absence. And this practice, this deliberate discomfort in the middle of comfort, is something almost nobody who quotes Seneca today actually does. They keep the comfort and skip the training. They keep the luxury and skip the discipline. And that gap between the philosophy and the practice is exactly the gap running through every single one of the 9 things we've covered so far. The gap between sounding wise and becoming wise. And now, in our final part, We're going to bring all 10 of these hidden truths together into the one lesson the ancient Stoics considered the most important of all, the lesson so uncomfortable that even Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire, burying his own children, and dying slowly from illness, could only half articulate it in his private journal, a lesson about what happens when you finally stop performing calm and start actually becoming, underneath everything, completely and permanently unshaken. Here we are at the final piece, the one Marcus Aurelius himself could barely finish writing, and to understand it you have to picture him the way he actually was in his last years, not the marble statue version of a wise emperor calmly dispensing quotes, but an aging sick man, ruling from military camps during a plague that killed millions, having buried at least 8 of his own children, writing meditations not for an audience, not for publication, not even really for himself in the way we think of journaling today, but as a kind of desperate, private argument he was having with his own mind, trying to convince himself, night after night, of things he clearly did not fully believe yet. And this is the 10th thing almost nobody explains. Meditations is not the record of a man who had already achieved Stoic peace. It is the record of a man who was still failing at it, repeatedly, and writing to himself anyway, which means the entire foundational text of Stoicism, the one modern readers treat as a finished manual for inner calm, was actually written by someone still very much in the middle of the struggle, still reminding himself in his 50s and 60s of lessons a true master would supposedly no longer need reminding of, still telling himself not to be angry at people who wrong him, still telling himself that death is nothing to fear, still telling himself that fame and legacy are empty. Over and over, book after book, and if a man who ruled the most powerful empire on earth, who had access to every philosopher, every teacher, every resource available in the ancient world, still had to fight this battle daily until his final breath, then the myth we've built around Stoicism, the idea that you read a few books, adopt a few habits, and arrive at permanent unshakable calm is exactly that, a myth, and the real, final, uncomfortable truth the Stoics never fully explain to anyone is this: there is no arrival. There is no finished state where you become immune to grief, fear, anger, or attachment. There is only the daily practice of returning, again and again, to the same handful of ideas, the same reminders, the same quiet arguments with your own mind, for the rest of your life, without ever fully winning. And the Stoics, who are remembered as the wisest, were not the ones who achieved some final enlightened peace. They were simply the ones who kept showing up to the argument decade after decade, who kept writing the reminder in the letter, in the journal, in the private notebook nobody else was supposed to read. And this reframes everything we've covered across this entire series. The indifference that isn't really peace, the forgiveness that's really detachment, the grief that must be felt and then released, the anger that must be caught before it ignites, the open door that exists but is almost never meant to be used, the wealth that must be held loosely enough to lose without collapse. All of it, every single lesson, was never meant to be mastered once and checked off a list. It was meant to be practiced daily, imperfectly, by people who fail constantly and return anyway. And if that sounds less inspiring than the polished quote cards you're used to seeing, it should, because the real philosophy was never meant to be inspiring in that shallow way. It was meant to be honest, and the honest truth is that becoming unshaken was never really the goal at all. The goal was learning how to keep standing back up, quietly, without applause, every single time life knocked you down. And that is the one thing the Stoics never explained clearly enough for the world to actually hear it until now. Before you close this out, there is one more thing, something that was never listed alongside the other 9, because it isn't really a thing. The Stoics taught it all. It's the thing hiding underneath everything they taught, the quiet assumption running beneath every letter Seneca wrote, every private note Marcus scratched down by lamplight, every harsh lesson Epictetus drilled into students who showed up looking for comfort and left with homework instead. And it is this. None of this was ever actually about becoming calm. Calm was just the byproduct. The thing that showed up as a side effect. Once something much harder had already been done. And that much harder thing was learning to stop negotiating with reality. Because if you go back through everything we've covered, the fake forgiveness that's really detachment, the love practiced under the shadow of loss, the grief that gets felt and then released on schedule, the anger caught before it ignites, the open door that exists but is rarely walked through, the wealth held loosely enough to survive its own loss, the endless daily failure Marcus recorded in his own journal. You start to notice they all share one hidden mechanism. And it's this, every single time. The Stoic is refusing to argue with what has already happened. Refusing to spend energy wishing reality were different than it is. And this sounds simple when you say it out loud. Almost too simple to be the secret at the bottom of an entire philosophy that survived 2,000 years. But sit with it for a second. Because most human suffering, if you're honest, isn't caused by events themselves. It's caused by the argument we have with those events afterward, the endless internal courtroom where we replay what should have happened, what should be different, what someone should have said instead, what version of our life we were supposed to be living by now. And the Stoics figured out, earlier than almost anyone else in recorded history, that this internal courtroom is completely optional, that you can simply choose to stop holding the trial, not because the event wasn't painful, not because the loss wasn't real, but because the trial itself adds a second layer of suffering on top of the first one, a layer that is entirely self-manufactured, entirely within your control to end. And this is why Epictetus kept insisting that it's never the event that disturbs us, but our judgment about the event. Not as some tidy motivational phrase, but as a literal, practical instruction. Catch yourself the moment you start arguing with what already happened. And stop, and this single move, repeated 10,000 times across a lifetime, is the actual mechanism behind everything we've discussed in this series. It's what was really happening when Marcus reminded himself not to be angry at people who wronged him. He was refusing to argue with the fact that flawed people exist and sometimes hurt you. It's what was really happening when Seneca practiced voluntary poverty. He was rehearsing the refusal to argue with the eventual loss of comfort. It's what was really happening in the whole open door discussion, an acknowledgement that even death itself is not worth arguing with once it has actually arrived. And once you see this pattern, you realize the 10 things the Stoics never fully explain were never really 10 separate lessons at all. They were 10 different disguises for the exact same practice, worn differently depending on whether the subject was love or money, or anger or mortality. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you if you've made it this far. This means you cannot actually finish Stoicism. There is no 10th lesson that unlocks a permanent state, because the practice of not arguing with reality has to be renewed every single time reality delivers something new to argue with, which is constantly, daily, for the rest of your life. And this is precisely why Marcus Aurelius, dying of illness in a military camp, still felt the need to write himself the same reminders he'd been writing for decades. Not because he'd failed to learn them, but because the argument reopens every single day, whether you want it to or not. New losses, new insults, new disappointments. Each one a fresh invitation to step back into that internal courtroom. And the only actual skill, the only real thing separating a wise person from an ordinary one, is how quickly they notice they've climbed back onto the witness stand, and how quickly they're willing to step back down. And if you walk away from this entire series with nothing else, walk away with this. The next time something happens that you don't like, notice the exact moment your mind starts building its case. The shoulds, the should-nots, the if-onlys, and instead of finishing the argument, just set it down, not because the pain isn't real, but because the argument was never actually required. It was just a habit, one you're allowed to break, one breath at a time, starting now, and that, more than any quote, any cold shower, any Latin phrase printed on a mug, is the actual, complete, and finally honest answer to what the Stoics never explained to anyone, because they weren't hiding it out of secrecy. They were hiding it in plain sight, inside a practice too unglamorous and too endless to ever fit neatly on a quote card. And now that you know it, the only question left is whether you'll actually do it, or just watch one more video about it and move on.